as we come to tonight, it's going to focus on the Buddha's story. And I think for many of you here in the room know it. You've heard it at some level. And so if it's new, everything is new. But when it's known, then make one thing new. In the sense that I challenge you to think of one element in each slide that allows you to go deep. And it might deliver a question to the community so that we can work on it together. It just might be something you're thinking about. Again, our focus has been on yoga, so it might be related to yoga. But with each slide that we're doing, don't allow it to be routine. Allow it to be a thoughtful moment where you can think about it. Okay. When you think about Buddhism, I sort of really only had one in the room that would self-identify as a Buddhist explicitly. How does Buddhism engage your identity? How does Buddhism create your identity? If I were to ask you your favorite football team, are you a Chicago Cub, a Chicago Bears fan? No? Okay. No? So what's your favorite football team? Seattle Seahawks. How do the Seahawks shape you? Okay? So now come to Buddhism. How does Buddhism shape you? And it might be a core identity that you circle completely around. It might be a peripheral identity marker that you circle. For me, it's a peripheral identity marker. I just thoroughly enjoy the meditations. Just, wow. Have never been able to get enough from the meditations of this community. They're very meaningful to me. And so, because I'm here, I get to enjoy them. And so Buddhism becomes that wonderful. And this is what I try and do with all religions, is find one tool that I put in my quiver that's wonderfully meaningful to me. And for me, it's definitely been the meditations. But how does Buddhism influence or become core to your identity?
For me, it's just made the most sense in life. It's really been the easiest for me to believe or fall in line with all the I've been exposed to a lot of other religions that require a lot of maybe blind faith, or it's not as it's more based on like, this is what happened historically, or this is how the world began, creation myths and things like that. Whereas Buddhism has it has some of that, but a lot of it's just based more on your direct experience and things that you can kind of rationalize easily by just thinking about your own life. So I like the practical nature of it. And I've always been really drawn to like the aesthetics and the artwork of Buddhist communities and stuff like that. That was always a big draw to me, is just the aesthetics of it all.
Wonderful. How does it influence or form your identity? Or is this just interesting? It's an interesting educational, knowledge-building process. Is there a way to give it a little more identity to you?
I saw the Dalai Lama had a conversation with an American politician, a member of Congress, and of course somebody from the Western traditions, and trying to wrap his head around Buddhism, and he asked, like, Dalai Lama, do you pray? Yes, I pray. Well, who do you pray to? I pray to myself. And like, who else is more powerful in your universe to do anything for you than your own self? There really isn't any force that's any more powerful than you are in your own existence. So it's like that's what I think about in Buddhism. It's a way, it's a sort of picking yourself up by your bootstraps kind of religion. You don't have to reach outside of yourself for anything.
Excellent. Excellent. Any other comment on the identity of Buddhism?
Just for me, just having the freedom to even think about it, because we have never been allowed to think about it growing up. And just adding on to our first conversation of something unique, I wanted to get Brian through my studio door and said, "Oh, here's something." I said, "This is the first time I've ever," remember when I bought a lottery ticket this week. Okay. Have I ever bought a lottery ticket? No, probably not ever, because I've never had the freedom to buy a lottery ticket without feeling a tremendous amount of guilt, because that's just what you come from, And I said, this is the first time I've ever done anything like this without feeling any guilt at all, of being able to do something and be jubilant and have fun and just enjoy the process. But to be able to think about something and realize that it's okay to think about something that's not what you've been brought up with. That's about as far as I can get.
My brother came up to me a couple weeks back. He's 6'5", 4 years younger than I am, my little brother. And he looks at me, he says, "I think I'm a Buddhist." Well, that's a comment from this guy. He's been in a Christian environment his entire life. I can't imagine where he's even been exposed to Buddhism. I says, "Well, how'd this happen?" He says, "Well, I took a test, and it asked me a bunch of questions about ideas that were Buddhist, and I think I've decided I'm a Buddhist." And I said, "Well, what's the most meaningful one?" And he said, it's being present right now. This moment, just being here, part of this, right now, that's where we're at. And it just hit me so wonderfully hard that so many in our community aren't present, and they don't know how to get there. And so the beauty of meditation is it forces you to be present. The beauty of the conversation of Buddhism is it encourages you to be present. And so that was such an interesting conversation. I'm glad that he felt free enough to talk to me about it. Formally, to be a Buddhist is one who follows the path of the Buddha. Okay? That's a formal definition. It makes sense. If you're going to call yourself a Buddhist, you probably better at least appreciate, if not know, the path of the Buddha fairly well. Yay, Ashley made it. Come on in. Oh, it's just fine whenever you get here. It means to identify with Siddhartha Gautama. And that's hard. This is a guy that was, that lived about 2,500 years ago. So it's hard to sort of say, wow, I really want to follow this guy that, it is nowhere near my context, nowhere near my community, operates in a completely different environment that I could ever dream of environment. I mean, after some time in Hinduism, I hope you begin to appreciate how radically different the context was that India was 2,500 years ago. And so then to say, well, I think I'm going to follow this guy, is quite a statement, because it means you're going to have to do an awful lot of contextualization about who the Buddha is and how do we make these inferences of someone that did what he did in his community. While we're there, who else was chugging around 2,500 years ago? So we're in 500 BCE. What other major religious figures, or if you know your history, other historical figures were chugging around within a few hundred years of 500 BCE?
I was totally guessed, but from the Chinese side, you have Confucius and Lao Tzu.
Very much. So our Chinese philosophy itself is founded in this period. The dominant parts of Chinese philosophy are 500 BCE. Give me some more. And so we don't have Christianity yet. We don't have Islam yet. So what's Judaism?
Hinduism, right?
So Hinduism, what's happening in Hinduism 500 BCE?
It's fragmented, but they were certainly active.
Okay. The key movement that's happening in India at this time, they call it the forest dwellers. It's the movement into the forests. We don't have a key figure to frame around, but it's a movement of that's happening, and the reason it's happening, and the reason the Hindus are going into the forests, is because they're discovering what they're discovering is so powerful they don't want to be around people. And so part of the Buddha's story is going to be his movement into the forests. But there was this perception that whatever they're studying, whatever's happening, this is way too powerful. And this is happening around this time period within Hinduism. Judaism is really being formed by Ezra in 500 BCE. Does anybody know the Jewish story enough to say, who's Ezra? Anybody got that one? He was the one that came back from the exile. They had been, the Babylonians had stripped Jerusalem of all the key Jews, taken them to Babylon. They're now coming back after about a 70-year exile, and they're now re-arriving. And we really say that Judaism started with Ezra. We don't say it started with Moses or Abraham. It started with Ezra as he rejuvenated Judaism in this time period. And so this is active in 500 BC. And so we call this the golden age of religion, is 500 BCE, because we have so many that are cultivating these ideas, and they stuck. They truly stuck and influenced vast swaths of humanity, really all of humanity, in dramatic ways. And so that's why 2500 is an important. This is the golden era of religion, when for some reason these ideas were just flowing, and the creativity and what it takes to be a founder of a religion was somehow here. And that's an intriguing part of the story of the Buddha. So this is a founded religion. Why do I say it that way? This is a founded religion. What isn't a founded religion? I need to give exams in Hinduism.
Yeah. I was going to say Hinduism.
Thank you. And so Hinduism is not considered a founded religion. Why? Because we don't have a founder. There's not one individual we put our name on Hinduism. Most of these religions are founded religions, and Buddhism is a founded religion. And so that makes it intriguing, because then as soon as you have a founder, you have a story. But what the Buddha is not, is he's not considered a god, or even a prophet of God. And so what religion was the founder a god?
Judaism.
Ezra?
Mm-hmm. Oh, the founder.
The founder.
I'm sorry, the founder.
Was the founder considered a god?
Christianity is.
Christianity. Okay? And so Jesus is defined as divine. Jesus is defined as a god. And there's departures from that. But from the broad scope of Christianity, you would find that most Christians would believe that Jesus is fully human and fully divine. It's sort of one of the ways they self-identify. And so Buddhism, the Buddha, is not divine or a prophet of God. Who defined themselves as a prophet of God? That was a founder. Muhammad was a prophet of God. And certainly Jesus was a prophet of God as well. But Muhammad wanted to stop there. He just wanted to say, what I have heard, what I have written down, comes from God, and I am a prophet of God. And so that becomes a wonderful illustration of the prophetic. Buddha is not a prophet of God. Whatever he will be saying, he is not channeling from some other source. He's not saying, I've had my visions, I've had my dreams, I've had my encounters with something greater than I. I am now simply giving you the content of those visions and dreams. And so that would be the prophetic voice that you see in religions and in founded religions. And so he is a teacher and a model for the lives of his believers. Know his story. Live his story. Model your life after the story of the Buddha. And that becomes a valuable way of reincarnating the Buddha, is to take his story and make it your story. And that takes the life and relives it again. And though reincarnation often is thought of in different contexts, it's where after Hinduism, I always struggle, and I want to use the word soul, but I can't use this word soul. So can't use the word Atman. We're going to learn that in a second. But it's that key Buddhist word for that which is in me that is carried into the next life. I shouldn't use spirit. This is a tough night tonight. So it'll come. It'll come. It's in there somewhere. But it's that essence. You could use the term essence, that which is transmitted from life to life. And so he's the teacher and a model. And so teachers appreciate Buddhism because there's that respect for teaching. And the key conversation we were having last time is the Buddha existed for many lifetimes before, and there have been other Buddhas. Where did we have that conversation last week? Of other Buddhas that are still respected and venerated. Who is that? Dalai Lama. Okay. Does he self-identify as a Buddha?
I think it's believed that he's like the reincarnation of Avalokitesvara, which I think other people have said Avalokitesvara was the reincarnation of the Buddha. So I'm not sure.
So he doesn't sit on the topic. From my reading of his literature, I don't find him sitting on it as a key self-identifying point. I think he has been defined as a Buddha by those who appreciate his work and his teachings, and it's well earned. The Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama, is going to self-identify in clear ways that particular task. But I think we get the privilege of defining others. What was the other Buddha? We have the Dalai Lama. We could certainly reference as a incarnation of the Buddha.
Our laughing Buddha.
Our happy Buddha, our laughing Buddha, that statue you see in so many places is actually 1,500 years after the Buddha, and so that's an interesting illustration. So when we see a representation like that, that's not the happy Buddha. The happy Buddha is quite a different representation. So he represents himself when he was in his personal biography as an incarnation of the Buddha. Okay. So the sacred biography, we've talked about the 6th century, we've talked about Hinduism, Jainism are forming. We've talked about it as a creative period. The dilemma for Buddhism is that the first biographical writer we have presents the Buddha as both mythological and biographical. And the reason is, the first biography is 500 years later. Okay? Now, classically, it takes time for biographers to go, "Ooh, this is important, I better write this down." And so what religious awareness do you have of any other biographical story being written down, of any of the other religions? Does anyone have
Well,
any?
it took 100 years for Christianity to be written down, apparently.
Easily, yeah. Most of the writings we have in Christianity are 70 to 100 years old. Before the Gospels are being written. The Gospels are not being written until 80, 90, 100 is typical dating. So there's 100 years, okay, for Christianity.
So it starts with just oral tradition going and going and going.
Yeah. Story of Moses, when was it finally written down? Anybody know? Very well the time of Ezra, about 1,000 years later. I mean, it was a long time. We have fragments. There's nothing as coherent until very deep into Judaism as they were writing down the oral stories that were coming through. So what's the challenge 500 years after a person lives? What's the challenge of what we're saying here, mythological and biographical? What do we just have to appreciate when we've got writing happening 500 years later, 600 years later?
It's all kind of hearsay passed down from one person to the next to the next.
Yeah. And when we say hearsay, we tend to think the telephone story. What's the telephone story?
Lost in translation.
Yeah, things can get lost in translation. And we sort of prove that to ourselves. I would like to argue that the brains of everybody pre-Gutenberg were vastly better at memorizing than our brains. Now, why am I saying that?
Because that's how they did things back then.
Because pre-Gutenberg, they had to memorize everything. And so the stories of all the religions were dependent on the people who heard the stories memorizing it. And do you think they would probably memorize it fairly accurately?
Yeah, if that's your job to memorize.
It really is.
Yeah.
And each generation, if you look at these ancient religions, and I've just watched Jewish families as they prepare for their bar or bat mitzvahs, what the kiddies have to learn, and that's formal memory of the Torah, and it has to be perfect. It has to be note perfect so they can sing the notes of the particular passage, let alone verbally or saying the exact words. And the parents will make sure that it is exact, both from a harmonic point of view as well as from a word point of view. I'd like to argue that we, as humans, had the capacity of memory that was perfect, virtually. All little issues would grow. But even for hundreds of years, oral cultures can transmit documents and stories perfectly because that was their only way of knowing things. And so I'd like to put the telephone story aside. That's for our mechanisms of memories. For these kinds of ancient cultures, I'd like to have an awful lot more confidence that as these stories are being transmitted, they're being transmitted terribly carefully, and they're being locked from generation to generation. Make any sense, folks? That's a pretty hard argument in our culture. I could teach you a method, which is called the medieval mind mapping method, where you could memorize 1,000 things in a row and not make a mistake. I could teach you that. Nobody asks me to teach it. Very few do. I had some students, after I've done this kind of stuff, come in and ask me to do this. I purposely learned it because I was going back and studying ancient languages. I decided I was not well trained. I realized what had happened, And I decided to find out how the medievals memorized things pre-Gutenberg. And it is a distinctly different way of memorizing that creates permanent memory, not our kind of memory. You learn something, you do your flashcards, you walk out the door after the exam and you've forgotten everything on the flashcards. Highly temporary memory. The medievals had permanent memory. So once they locked in on it, they could not forget it. It was so well developed. And so that's a very intriguing memory dynamic that's basically been lost into our culture. There's little nuances of it that we use here and there. But as far as fully systematized, they did it, and we just take bits and pieces of it now in some of our memory. It's called the medieval mind mapping system. And the premise of it is you have a perfect memory of your house. Close your eyes. Can you see your front door? Open the door. Can you see the entry room? Can you see everything in the entry room? Now walk into your living room. Can you see everything in your living room? You know everything in that room. Okay? Just sort of let your mind circle the entire living room. You can see absolutely everything, and I think you know it's perfect, your memory of that living room. Now walk into the kitchen. Do a full circle in the kitchen. You can see everything in that room, and you know that your mind has perfectly memorized that kitchen. Okay? Have I proved my point? Your memory is actually, when it's structured like a video camera, is amazingly good and amazingly perfect. What the medievals would do is they would place oddities in each room or each wall or they would place oddities, and then they would simply walk through their house, and they'd see the oddities that were in the room that didn't make sense, and that would cue what they needed to memorize, and then they would let that develop into whatever it was, for whatever you're memorizing, all the Buddhist words. You could literally mind map all of the Buddhist words, and for the first, what's the first one? What's the first Buddhist word? Bodhisattva. And so you would make it, typically you'd make it crazy. You'd start at your door, or you'd start in your front lawn, and you'd have a body of a Saturday vat or something. There's where you make, they would do something weird in that first step of the pathway. So that they would go, there's a body of a Saturday vat of wine sitting on your pathway. Well, the minute you've got that story, then you just put the number 2 word on your front door, and the number 3 word, and the number 4 word, and then you'd walk through your house, and you would perfectly be able to do that, and you couldn't forget the dang thing. It's when it's done and done well, it's hard to build the narrative and the story of memory development, but you could memorize vast quantities of items by using the medieval mind mapping method. It's a wonderful method of permanent memory. So I would argue we have the capacity. They may have had a totally different system, but they had the capacity to do that. We can see in some of the ancient literature mnemonics. We can see alphabets. We can see lots of ways they were trying to teach their children sacred literature. And so there's many techniques, but that was one that I was able to discover. And so I would like to argue that yes, we're 500 or 600 years late, but it's good. It's really good. You can take a boatload of it to the bank. Fair enough? Music has long been a memory dynamic for cultures. The point of music is really to deliver key information into cultures. And so the reason for music is often as memory techniques. So it's another technique that is widely and important. Okay. There's no way to unravel the mythological from the biographical. You just can't do it when you're reading the Buddhist story. And the challenge when you're reading the Buddhist story is when you change when you change contexts, a Japanese story of the Buddha is different than a Chinese story of the Buddha, which is different than a Thai story of the Buddha. So they're all different. They come from different communities. Your Tibetan community has variances from Mahayana, which has differences from Theravada. And so there's just differences within the communities that makes the community. It's just sort of what defines a community, is reading something different. And the story of the Buddha, because it's so intrinsic to Buddhism, has these variances to it. No way to unravel it. Other important religious figures of the day were wandering ascetics. They'd withdrawn from society and had gone into the forests. We've already talked about that. And there was extraordinary tension with the Brahmin establishment. They were the key caste. They were defining the religious traditions. And you were forced into the forest if you were competing with the Brahmin establishment, and we're going to see lots of competition. There was lots of discussion groups. They had those too, and the key points: karma, samsara, rebirth, soul, liberation. Those were all the points of conversation. How can you talk about it? How can you build on it? How can you discuss it in ways that are meaningful? So Siddhartha searched for truth, experienced a great awakening, found the ultimate truth, became the Buddha, and taught a community for 45 years. So how would you like me to encapsulate your life in one sentence? Because that's what we've done here for the Buddha. Is a one sentence, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 point walking through his life. But there's an interesting summation. In his teaching, the ultimate truth, Buddhists believe, can be found. Comments on that? Anything on that slide that is a point you'd like to dive into?
How do you, maybe you discuss this later, or maybe this is just, I don't know. How do you just go from being Siddhartha to Buddha? Like, how do you just
Yeah, good question.
become the Buddha one day? Like, one day I'm just the Buddha now.
We sat under a tree for 49 days and meditated.
But do you think he was the first one to do that?
Well, why did it work for
Just
him?
to build on her question. Somehow it worked. Okay, well, why else?
Well, I think a big part of it was he was a prince, right? So he was already royalty. He was already an extremely privileged person, and people were already listening to him before he was even awakened. I think a lot of people were following him on his spiritual journey, and everybody was kind of in admiration of him and impressed by his intellect and his health and his good looks and things like that. So he was kind of a charismatic person.
Excellent. So charismata, I think, is a lovely word to recognize that something is going to impress people. Something's going to impress people. And charismata, that's our classic way of discovering that. If Prince Harry walked in the room, do you all know who Prince Harry is? Which is amazing for American society. They've got a better understanding of British monarchy than the British do. But Prince Harry, and were to walk in the room, would you be awestruck? And in that awestruckness,
You're kind of like, what? Yeah.
in that awestruckness, would you not have a story for the rest of your life?
Yeah.
For me, I met Queen Elizabeth. I really didn't meet her. She was in my town, and she drove by, and I waved, and she waved back, sort of at everybody around me. But she was right there in a car, 20 feet away. And that night she was in, this was in a little town in British Columbia. She went in, and the story that roared through town was that she ate chicken with her fingers. And now we can eat chicken with our fingers, because the Queen did it. I'll never forget that story. Because to build on that comment, when you have someone that's predefined as someone that you should know, even if you don't know, you should know them, then you remember your interaction with them. And then the stories just start multiplying, let alone of all the stories the queen would have had in her entire reign of all the people she's met. Every one of them would have remembered a story. And so then the collection of the next 100 to 500 years is which one of those stories are meaningful and dramatic and powerful. And they're collected into documents that become sacred for everyone that knows the story or is a member of my family who has heard my story. And those documents grow and build and develop. So somehow that rock star
Crazy.
feel to this settled in on Siddhartha Gautama. And the story should bear this out. Okay? So as we're saying, so this there was, for the Buddha, there's previous lifetimes of much merit and wisdom. And here's a story that they tell to sort of illustrate what's happening with the Buddha. Prince Mahasattva, strolling in a forest, comes upon a tigress and 7 cubs. The tigress was too weak to care for the newborns. The prince decided to give his life to save the family. He slit his throat to cover himself with blood that the tigress ate, and she regained strength. Buddha was that prince. Buddha grew in compassion and perfected his wisdom with each life. So that living and dying and living and dying and living and dying created an aura around that lineage that becomes obvious as you were narrating with your individual that had a story that seemed to be from the Titanic. Well, we all know the Titanic. We all have a connection to that story at some level. And so when we meet someone that has an incarnation from the Titanic, then now we're building on that. Now, so they have to assume with the idea of reincarnation that the Buddha is lifetimes of good upon good upon good upon good that is now settling in this one individual. And somehow everybody senses it. He had royal parents. They were king and queen of what we now know as Nepal. And so there's a historical reality that now centers on the story. But then the mythological easily comes into the story. The mother-to-be saw a white elephant approach and enter her body. She gave birth with her side, from her side, while she was standing up. 4 guardian kings placed him in a golden net. The heavens shook. Other events of this were of world significance. Okay? Now, tell me about other religions. How do other religions create credibility? Because you've got to create credibility for this individual to be the Buddha at the end of the day.
They add signs that point to something special.
Okay? So, tell me a couple. What are the signs that other religions use to say this is an important person?
Star of Bethlehem.
Star of Bethlehem. Yeah? And who traipsed after this Star of Bethlehem? The shepherds.
And the others,
And
A bunch of wise guys.
these wise guys, who came from where?
Iran?
We assume Iran, Persia. They were the most knowledgeable scholars of the day in astronomy. And so we assume they're also Zoroastrians. And so all of a sudden Christianity becomes informed, and its credibility is being built by wise guys from Zoroastrian wise guys from Persia. Muhammad got his credibility from a Christian monk. The story is constantly told that a Christian monk told Muhammad that he was on the right path. And so all religions seek that level of credibility. And we use those kinds of tools here. And so for Christianity, we have the virgin birth. an essential part of Christian thought, is that the mother was a virgin. Well, so you're getting these kinds of narratives that are clearly mythological, but not untrue. They're just part of the narrative of the story. So we have a date of 563 BCE, wonderfully disputed. His mother died 7 days afterwards. And 7 we talked about, haven't we? The meaning of 7. And so this would be considered a death, but it would be a divinely inspired death. It would be the number of the divine. So they hold the 7 in the story. He was educated and protected in royal luxury, grew up, married, and had a kid. Finally saw the struggles of non-royal life. Okay? But before we move to that one, what point here struck you of the Buddha's story? So now we have a rock star, prince. I mean, we have a real prince here. Okay, what other elements? Was any element here that struck you in the story of the Buddha from his royal heritage? Socioeconomically, wonderfully wealthy, successful in marriage, it looks like, successful in having children. Therefore, his child now is an heir to his throne, but he's got to maintain that to continue the lineage. He's going to create devastation if he walks away from this. We know the end of the story. He's going to create devastation in Nepal when he walks away. Okay. Any other points that you're fascinated by? So we have what is now called the Great Renunciation. And so there was some sense that he realized that he was being raised in a bubble. How many of you have spent some time in your life raised in a bubble? Your parents created a bubble for you. Your family created a bubble for you. Your church created a bubble for you. Have you ever sensed living in somebody else's bubble? He was in a big bubble because he was royal, and they had to teach him. It's been fascinating to watch all the stories of Queen Elizabeth. And one of the greatest frustrations in The Crown, if you watched, and The Crown is Queen Elizabeth, right? Is that she was given a totally different education than all other children. She was given a royal education, but she didn't have a clue on mathematics, or she didn't have a clue on some of the basic ideas of a typical grade school education, because she had been totally trained in totally different areas. So you can imagine the bubble this guy was feeling as he would look across the kingdom that he clearly had a good view of, and realize that he knew nothing about what was happening in the lives of the people coming in and out of the palace. And so he made this demand that he wanted to see this. If he was going to be king of this, he wanted to know what he was king of. What's the kingdom look like? And so the king and his advisors then created the scenario. Well, we can let him go up, but we don't want him to catch too much of the story here. This could be depressing. It could distract him from what he has to do. So we'll create a parade, and we'll get this great grand parade. And we'll show him the best of the kingdom, and we'll bring him back to the palace, and he won't be that much informed by it. And so the story that I've seen is that on an excursion that may have been meant as a parade to see his kingdom, he departed from the planned route and saw the 4 struggles of life. He refused to keep going, so he said, I want out of this. He dropped into a side alley of the town that they were parading him through. And he saw an old, decrepit man. And he had to come to grips with old age. He saw a diseased man. And he had to come to grips with illness and the hope for health. He saw a dead man. And he had to come to an understanding of what death meant. And he saw a hermit. one who had withdrawn from the world and seemed above all the struggles. At that moment, Siddhartha decided to do the same as the fourth man, to find truth. What are you seeing in the great renunciation?
I feel like one of the important things was the fact that he was isolated, like we were saying, in the bubble or whatnot. Because I have a friend who was not even allowed to walk around the block around her house by herself till she was like 17, and finally said, I'm just going to do it, you know. And last month she moved to Cairo, Egypt by herself. Took her cat with her. She's living over there because she likes Egyptians.
Yeah.
You know, so I mean, that isolation just makes people want to get out, you know. I think that's important.
Excellent. How did you break out of your bubble that your family created for you? What was your bubble breaking moment?
Running away.
Pardon?
Running away.
Running away. Was it literal run away for you, or just...
At one point, yeah.
Yeah, you just ran away. Get out of the bubble for a while. What did you see when you ran away? What, did you go back voluntarily
Not
to the
much.
bubble?
The rest of McCall, basically.
The rest of my call, you didn't hear, did you? That's wonderful. How many is college, the great renunciation? For many of us. High school is still really an extended bubble in a lot of ways. But college, especially if you leave town, huge renunciation. And your parents feel it when you come back. I came back and proceeded to tell my mother she was a terrible raiser-upper of my 13-year-old sister who was clearly having problems, and my mother and I had a child psychology. I mean, I just finished that course and got my A. So I decided to give my mother a real good conversation on child psychology. Well, my mother's an RN. That went over just, lead balloon kind of thing. Yeah, boom, it just landed in my lap.
I think you've been chewing on that one for
A long time. So we all have that opportunity in our lives. Every time we move, we often renunciate that which we leave behind and pick it up in a new place if you've had that opportunity in your life. So there's these opportunities of changing who you were. And so for 6 years, he then wandered and studied the yogic knowledge and techniques. And so here, he is focusing on yoga. He's focusing on their techniques and what they're doing. And so it becomes an intriguingly important way. But 6 years. Why is 6? 6. When you see the 6 in religious literature, where do you see 6 and it makes your hair stand up on end?
The mark of the beast.
The mark of the beast is what?
666.
666, and we discovered that whenever something is stated 3 times, it's that sense of, as powerfully as we can state it, it's 666, mark of the beast. It's in religious literature, it's just incomplete. It really just means you haven't got to 7 yet. You're not done. You're an incomplete in what you're doing. And so when you see it, you tend to put incompleteness within the 6s. So he spent 6 years wandering, studying yogic knowledge. Mahavira, thank you. I finally cued myself on the name I had forgotten. Mahavira is the founder of the Jains, and so he the Jains. If you do have a chance to study with us in the end of November and December, when you study the Jains continue to be the most aggressive of Hindu and yogic practices on the planet today. Mahavira wouldn't wash, because if he washed, he would kill something. He might kill a bug, so he wouldn't wash. A Jain will sweep the path in front of them so that they won't step on a bug. A Jain will live in the coldest environment or the hottest environment simply to be aesthetically aggressive in their search for enlightenment. Mahatma Gandhi came from a Jain community. Mahatma Gandhi did what he did because of his awareness of Jain techniques. And he chose fasting for 40 days to free India from the British Empire. And it was only because, they feel, because of he wasn't a Jain, but he grew up in a Jain environment, that he had the capacity to use aggressive Hindu techniques to solve a problem. And so the Jains are amazing. And here we have these Jains, Mahavira, just doing aggressive, they would purposefully spit on him and kick dust on him, because he'd be sitting there doing not much. And he just endured all pain, all struggles, anything imaginable is who Mahavira is. So he's wonderful. They're wonderful to study because they cause incredible things to happen. And so there's the change. Okay, so this becomes one of the more it becomes life-changing. And if you can think of the moment in your life when something was life-changing for you, and how that was motivated for you, and for me, probably the life-changing moment was winning a public speaking contest in New York City. And I was coming out of a little wee town out of British Columbia, and I won in my area, I won in the region, and I had a chance to go to New York City as an 11th grade kid and speak in the United Nations and in part in a subset of the United Nations where we had our international competition. Wow, does that ever change your life? That you're given affirmation that you have the capacity of public speaking. And so there's these moments in life when you just, something can cause you to swerve, to change, to do something different. What is so fascinating in Buddhism is this is the story. A cowherd woman brought him rice, and he saw a middle way between luxury and extreme asceticism. Now, what's so important about this story?
And most of the people trying to find enlightenment at the time were doing the asceticism, and he was hanging out with these guys who were doing the asceticism, and then he found this gal, gave him some food, and he's like, well, maybe there's another way to go about it.
Yep. He had 5 disciples that were with him in the forest. Guess what happened after he did this?
Didn't they leave him?
They all left him. Okay? Because he was not living what they had agreed to do, and that's not to have a bowl of rice like this. It was to fight on. What else is so intriguing about this story? This is your engagement of women. Buddhism is going to have incredible engagement with women. It's going to succeed in communicating to women in ways that Hinduism is unable to. Doesn't do it very well. Even the goddess conversation we had within Hinduism, as it tries to negotiate women and the role of women and the value of women goddesses, which would speak to women. This is an incredible moment here. Because he had left his wife, he'd left his kid, he'd done the things that, doesn't usually make you the happiest person in a society when you do stuff like this. At a certain level, there was an expectation that you would become an ascetic if you wanted to find enlightenment. But this woman, and again, this was not a rich woman; it was a pretty poor woman. She just managed cows. She was the equivalent to the shepherd in the Jesus story. But a cowherd woman. Middle way. We've had a conversation on balance already. This is going to be the term for Buddhism. What do you think it means? What does the middle way mean now? With this story, what's it trying to teach us? What's the middle way?
moderation and wisdom.
But wisdom is found in moderation.
Mm-hmm.
Wisdom isn't in this extreme asceticism of his day, where they thought the wisdom would be. Wisdom is here, not here. Everybody, agrees that wisdom is a challenge and luxury, but they certainly were trying to get from the asceticism. So wisdom is found in moderation. Who else links up with this that lived in this time? 500 BCE. We forgot one whole group of folks. 500 BCE. Think Greek.
Oh,
Okay?
Philosophers.
Exactly. Anybody? There are three big philosophers. One from the early 500s, one from the mid 500s, and one from the 400s. Who am I talking about?
Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates.
Absolutely. We start with Socrates and Plato, and then Aristotle's in the late 400s. So they're all talking about how do you build a moral culture, and using middle way kind of thinking as well. And so you're going to see similarities to Greek philosophy and their middle way, and Buddhism gives the middle way a pathway in philosophy of how to build an effective moral life. Because everybody can't run out to the forest and do their thing out there. Most of us have to live just our lives. Most of India just has to live their lives. Please give me a life that's meaningful today, and it doesn't mean I have to leave everything and run under a tree. But he did sat under the Bodhi tree. He meditated and waited for enlightenment. The story then is of incredible spiritual battles that he faced. But his meditation, he was capable of conquering.
In the story, how long, for different counts, how long was he sitting under this?
You gave us 40 days?
49.
49?
Was it?
Okay.
Okay.
Anybody else have any different numbers from their traditions that they might be aware of? It was a long time. Yeah. And why, again, is this? Can you think of any other religious traditions that did aggressive fasting? We've already seen the Jains did it. That's just normal for them.
The Native Americans.
Native Americans, absolutely, use fasting as their spiritual cleansing, and often a long time journeys into the wilderness for them. We can discover. Jesus had 40 days in the desert.
Yeah.
Immediately after he was baptized, he had 40 days in the desert. An interesting another 40. 40 often is meaningful in that that's how typically long it takes to change a habit. 40 days to change a habit. So 40 is fascinating for a lot of moral reasons. His attaining. And so there are a number of watches, and I believe 4 is the number of watches we attribute to his enlightenment. The first watch was to review all his former existences, then turned his compassionate mind to the suffering of others. First watch. Second watch, attained the divine eye, that eye that's often in the forehead. Attained the divine eye to see the whole world, and saw repeated birth and death. Grew in compassion. So there's those things that he was seeing in the city, in the byroads. He was seeing suffering. He was seeing death. Third watch, saw causes of endless rebirth, ignorance and yearning for existence. Saw a path to the cessation of the cycle, and that is going to become the eightfold path. 8 represents what in ancient numerology? 8 represents what? Heard about 6 tonight, heard about 7. What's 8 represent?
I thought 4 was Earth. Is it like that? Or
Doubling of the 4.
Divine.
I think of 8 as it.
Divine is 7. Think of creation. How many days of creation are classic? In many, we have 7 days of creation. Well, what's the 8th day called? In a cyclical fashion, it's the beginning of the new week. And so 8 has always represented new beginnings, new representations, the new year of the week. It's If we use, I don't know whether you like using Sunday or Monday as the first day of the week. We tend to think of Monday, but it's your first day of recreation. It's recreation, and you recreate every week on the first day of the week. So 8 represents recreation in the ancient numerology, and so there is the discovery there. And the 4th watch, dawn appeared, and the world was tranquil. And so we're really struggling here to sort of decide what's enlightenment, because this is what he's achieving here. It's his turning point intellectually and spiritually, and we call that enlightenment. Do you have any sense on what enlightenment means to you, to others, to the literature you've read? What is enlightenment to your world?
Seems like not having many more questions, like a lot of having answers to a lot of the questions that you were asking.
Excellent. The questions are resolved. Excellent way of framing it. Jody had a nice way of talking about enlightenment. I'm having my moments tonight. I'm saying things that I'm a bad lawyer. I don't have my answer in the tip of my tongue. See another word. No one else remembers it. Last time, or when I'm editing these lectures now for YouTube, and we discovered that enlightenment was not living as a dualist. Enlightenment is living as a monist, living in oneness, as opposed to the dualities that define life. Do you remember that conversation? And we really gave that as a Hindu definition of enlightenment, is not living like a dualist. It's an interesting point. I don't remember saying it, but I have the video to prove that I said it.
That was sort of the catalyst for this Titanic gal. She had posted on Facebook dualism, FTW, and I had to look up what FTW meant, but it was for the win. And so she had chosen dualism, and I thought, well, that's crazy. She doesn't even know what dualism is. Because, so anyway, yeah, that was
Okay.
It's funny.
There's contentedness here. There's contentedness. If you've arrived at a moment of extraordinary contentedness in life, as opposed to passion-filled, I need more, I need more, I need more. This is extraordinary contentedness. That I have all that I need. How else might you want to define enlightenment? This is very hard on the Western mind.
No separation.
Thank you. Say it a little louder.
Separation.
No separation. And grow that idea a little bit.
Just oneness.
That oneness. Thank you. No separation. No distinctions. No me and thee. No male and female. Yeah. No separation. Excellent. Anything else? Okay. Hard concept. Spend the rest of your life working on it.
Could there be like there's probably a few different ways of, when you think about being enlightened about something, you can be enlightened about different things, like when we immersed ourselves in the homeless community, we were enlightened about their world which we had not even been a part of, and you become enlightened to that. It's not a total enlightenment about all things, but it's an enlightenment about that. And
The
so
universal understanding, right?
yeah, it's a universal understanding going, oh, I didn't get that until now. Oh, I see that. I'm experiencing, you don't become homeless, but you kind of have an understanding that you didn't have because of your encounters. So it's not just this kind of, I'm thinking about the word sanctification, which we just thought, well, what is that? It's a mystical thing that, that, how do we get that? Is it an experience? Is it something that happens to us, outside of ourselves? And really, it's just this accumulation of enlightened moments that finally kind of pull it all together to where you can have an overall. That's just what I'm saying. It's not necessarily anything
The Buddha always liked the metaphor of the river when it comes to his trying to explain what enlightenment is. It's a favorite metaphor of the Tao on the changeableness. Nothing is the same. So the river is a good metaphor here, and the Buddha would say crossing over the river was what he did, and in American history, the crossing over of the river, that great moments of accomplishment that we use, and we use rivers so often. I tend to think of it as life is an awful lot of walking along the rivers of life. Enlightenment is diving in, becoming engaged, recognizing you are part of that which you are attracted to. We're all physically attracted to water because we have to have the stuff. But to jump in the water is a spiritual experience. It's why people come to McCall in the summertime. But it's that sense of engaging in a different environment. So the river is a metaphor that you can build on when it comes to enlightenment as well. But the key to the river is the river starts somewhere and must, to be a healthy river, must go somewhere. And the key to enlightenment isn't that you attain something. It's that you have something to share. It is not a cesspool of your experiences. It is a vibrant river that now informs your conversations with others. The key part of enlightenment to the Buddha wasn't that he became enlightened under the Bodhi tree. The key part of enlightenment for the Buddha is that he knew he had something to share. And so enlightenment, sadly, is highly egocentric when we think of it. But when the Buddha came to enlightenment, it was only enlightenment because he immediately then began to know that he had something he had to share for the rest of his life. And he did. And so that's also, what do you know, Mark, what do you know that you have to share? That's an element of enlightenment. That's very close to what we're dealing with here, if not bang on. You became so enthralled with the ideas that you were thinking about and you had received from others all through your life that you realized you had to get them down. Well, that's a good first step, but if you don't get to Chicago and tell everybody about what you're doing, then it's not enlightenment. It's just a cesspool of knowledge, festering in your head that never has a chance to get out. But this somehow is part of it, is we have to understand that it is only enlightenment when we continue to share with others. And he knew he needed to share those others with him. And so that's an essential element of enlightenment. And so he immediately taught the Four Noble Truths, the noble truth of sorrow, all of individuality of sorrow, birth, age, death, disease, contact with the unpleasant, separation from the pleasant, and every wish unfulfilled. So that becomes the noble truth of sorrow. Where does sorrow come from? When we walk out the room. When we walk out of the room, folks, we begin that journey of sorrow. Why? Because we're not together. We've enjoyed being together. And it's such a joy to get you guys floating through the check stand, a couple times a week. I get to see you a little bit, and there's great joy there for me. But the sorrow is when you depart. Think of your loved ones. That great sorrow when you're apart. Sometimes it's great joy. But most of the time, it's tremendous sorrow. When the ones you love, you're not around enough or often enough. So the noble truth of sorrow. The noble truth of the arising of sorrow. Sorrow arrives from craving, sensual pleasure, continued life, power, which leads to rebirth. And so the desires of life is what gives to sorrow. I want more, therefore I leave my family behind. It's odd when we know the story of the Buddha and we sort of use those kinds of metaphors, but it's true. I want more, I want more, I want more, but I'm not dealing with my family, and I'm not dealing with the issues that are important, and I'm not doing this and this. So the desires are pulling me away from that which gives me joy. And therefore it gives me sorrow. Does that make sense? So that desire is pulling me in the directions that are rupturing the joy of my life, and therefore become the sorrow of my life. The noble truth of stopping the sorrow, stopping the craving so that no passion remains. Leave it, be free of it, be released from it, give it no place. And so this is the great joy of yoga, right? Stopping the craving. The yoga gives you a sense of satisfaction and joy, often with others, of not worrying about the passions that are hitting you, not needing to go to Amazon or the mall or whatever, and whatever it is that gets your wheels going. And you don't have to do that. You don't have to shop. You don't have to. You just be in yoga. And so you've stopped the cravings. You've given your body a chance to rest and think about it, often with others. And so how do we stop the sorrow? We stop the capacity to crave. We stop the capacity to need other things. And the noble truth of the way. We stop the sorrow by following the Eightfold Path. We need right views, with right resolve, with right speech, with right conduct, with right livelihood, with right effort, with right mindfulness, and right concentration. Buddhist Eightfold Path. If we could only do that for 10 minutes, let alone one day.
Mm-hmm.
How's that for a challenge, folks? Trying to get the rightness of all of those impulses going in the right direction. You guys look trash, so I'm gonna pass on samsara. I'll come back to that. I'll pass on samsara because there's an intellectual demand here that I want to give us. I'll do that next week or the next time we see each other, and talk about founding the Sangha. This, folks, is a Sangha. It just is. What's a Sangha? A place where people come together and experience joy together. It's a place where sorrow is minimized because we have the opportunity of being together and sharing and being partners with one another. But for the Buddha, the Sangha became his place. And so guess who were the first 5 converts? The ones that walked away when he took the bowl of rice. Yeah. The ones who walked away were his first 5. Isn't that interesting? First 5. And so he began that collecting of people. That's the charismata, folks. That's the capacity to attract people around you. And that charismata is just, where does it come from? Where does it come from? It's just something that we have, that some can do. And most of us, it's just not important to us, or it's just not part of our worldview. But he began attracting people. I'm always amazed. Lynette can see auras. And I'll sit in places where someone's speaking, and I'll ask her, because artists can see auras. I mean, when I see a picture like this, the artist that formulated this could literally see the aura around them, and they draw it like this. Now, why can artists see auras?
Maybe it's a form of enlightenment.
It's a form of enlightenment. I agree. Now, what's enlightenment? We're on a pathway that'll help us to understand enlightenment. What is it? They can see something. They can see what most of us can't see. We can feel it with people. We can't always see it. But artists can see it, and they draw it. What are they drawing? Because you see this with all these amazingly charismatic people. It's the halo. Okay? The halo is exactly the same representation. What's it saying? Say it louder.
Light?
Light. And light is a form of?
Energy.
It's energy. Those folks that give energy to others are giving off, often have so much energy that they give it to others. And so it's one of the greatest gifts you can give someone is your smile. A smile takes far more energy than virtually any other facial characteristic. But a smile gives a person an energy boost. If they just see your smile, they can go for another few more minutes. The smile does that. It's a high energy activity that we do. Now magnify that by that speaker or that charismatic individual delivering some point of something. The energy coming off of them is something to behold. They are just exuding energy. Well, that's the aura that the artist draws. They can literally, Lynette can see it. She can see the energy coming off people. And I'll ask her, how big is the energy coming off this person? And she'll give me a description of what she can see.
It also comes off of people's hands as well. Usually from a distance they can see it. Not really up close. Well, sometimes up close, but yeah, that's.
Like Celestine prophecies. And their whole basis, isn't it? It's kind of interesting.
I've seen auras twice, and I've seen the halo once.
I see it a lot on older people, a lot of times, depending on what their personality is as well.
The halo was on an older person. The auras were on a young guy who was a Qigong instructor, and I was sitting in a yoga, meditative position right before the Qigong instruction started, and I could see one day it was gold aura, and the next time it was a silver aura.
Mm-hmm. There actually is the ability to photograph it.
Yeah.
Yes, there is. So I don't feel quite so weird now talking about it, because there are certain cameras that can pick it up. And so one of the key for me is, and my mother could see them when she was a young woman. She doesn't, probably wouldn't remember it now. But we can see certain light when the person is passing. That happens over one shoulder. And, within a couple of days of someone passing away, you'll be able to see it. Usually the right or left shoulder, one or the other. Far out, eh?
Isn't that weird?
That's kind of weird. I hope you still like me. Okay.
So his leadership was by enlightened monks. You had to have been enlightened before you could be a leader in this Sangha. And he grew that to 60 enlightened monks. And now he had the capacity to send out missionaries. So Buddhism is a missionary religion. It is going to send it out. It is going to take its message. It's going to package it up, simplify it, and make it understandable, and send it. And so this was a tremendous difference to Hinduism. There was no point in missionaries. Everyone who was Indian was a Hindu, and everyone who was a Hindu was an Indian. What's the point of missionaries when you're a Hindu? You just do what you do. And so when you have something new, you then can become a missionary religion, and Buddhism is. It's some of its major moves. It accepted all classes of people, and it broke the Indian caste system. So its acceptance of everyone was a crucial distinction, recognizing that there were some that were going to do it better than others. So it's not a matter, there is still a hierarchy happening here, but there is a recognition that all people can be part of the Sangha. So that was important. They accepted women as a separate order of nun, some of whom received full enlightenment. And so women now had a higher level of capacity of performing religiously than they did within Hinduism or in many of the other male-centered religions. They were still subordinate to male monks, and so there's a fascinating conversation there. Look at the precepts of the missionaries, or those who were the spiritual elites. Chastity, no possessions, begging for food, and nonviolence. Okay. Still okay with being a Buddhist? What's the symbol of Buddhism? The key premier symbol of Buddhism is what?
Humbleness or minimalism.
Yep. Now, make that into a real physical object. What's the real physical object that's humbleness and minimalism that is the symbol of Buddhism, classic Buddhism? It isn't so much more. Okay, Lynette's trying to do it.
Do this.
Oh, an offering hand.
Okay, close.
Bowl.
The bowl. It's a
Bowlery.
wooden, needs to be wooden, simplicity, wooden bowl. What you are given as you're graduating from monk school is going to be a wooden bowl. Because this is going to allow you to have no possessions, to beg for food, to participate in nonviolence, and to be chaste. The wooden bowl, because you're going begging for the rest of your life. Okay, think of those cities you visited with the Buddhist monks walking, parading down the street. What were they doing? They were participating in the begging for food. They were participating in having no possessions, and therefore they couldn't generate revenue. Therefore they had to go ask someone for food for that day. And why do we have typically a diet of vegetarianism within these Indian religions? Well, because they have to live out the nonviolence clause in their religious tradition. I will not kill animals to eat them. The number one point of nonviolence is don't kill animals, or each other, by the way. But don't kill animals. And that leads to the vegetarian diets, to minimize the violence towards animals. And so they accepted lay adherents, supporters, and expected them to live meritorious lives. So here's where the moral structure of their communities is beginning to be built. Okay, I'm going to stop here. Good place to stop. The last point I might say is that he died. So we're at his death, and I'm not dealing with his death. I'll let that be my bridge next time we meet. But the story of Buddhism. Folks, it's a tough story. It's a tough story. Final thoughts. Which part of the toughness is sort of grating you right now? This is what a Buddhist is. It's someone that lives the path of the Buddha. What's the struggle here? Especially for Americans.
Sounds a lot like perfection to me, that Eightfold Path there.
Yeah, we're pointing the lights pretty strongly on perfection, aren't we? And expectation of perfection. Yeah.
Not a lot of room for capitalism
Okay.
and
Materialism.
materialism.
Yeah. How are we supposed to build a consumer-driven society to generate what is now a pretty powerful economy in India? Let alone China with its Chinese Buddhism. I mean, how are they building these economies with these precepts? Okay. What else are you seeing that's final thoughts?
Requires a lot of discipline.
Yeah. And do we all need discipline? And does religion that works well offer you a discipline that will carry you to places you can't imagine? I think that's the number one gift of Buddhism, is a discipline to find something that's actually more meaningful than all the other stuff you've been fighting. And it gives you that discipline. Great gift. That's what he's asking. Is just discipline your life. Great word to finish on. Okay? So enjoy the thoughts of what the life of the Buddha means this week. If we don't see you next week, have a great interim, and we'll see you when you get a chance to be back.